Welcome back, it's Mr. Everett. Let's go over the French and Indian War. So, in part one, we talked about the French in North America, the competition that they had with the English in the Ohio River Valley, the three wars that were fought prior to the French and Indian War. That was King William's War, Queen Anne's War, and King George's War. All that involved the colonists to a certain extent, but not really at a point which, devastated their economy or occupied their lands or anything like that. Mostly these were European competitions between England and their maritime dominance of the Atlantic, and the French and their profits from the fur trade, and the Spanish with their new colonies that were firmly established by this point in Mexico, the Caribbean, and South America. So we're in 1755, right after the attack by a young George Washington, and we see here that the British, they decide to try and push the French out of this river valley area. This goes really bad for the British. So they send out one of their generals, Edward Braddock, to go and push the French out of the Ohio Valley. He fails. He attacks, and he's killed 10 miles from Fort Duquesne by thousands, 1,500 French and Indian forces. It was vastly outnumbered, and this becomes kind of an issue as far as how the war progresses from this point forward, because the British begin to see that in order to try and push the French and their Native American allies out of this region, they need a stronger commitment, not just from British regular troops, but within the colonies themselves. One success that they do have is that they push the French out of Nova Scotia and relocate many of them to Louisiana. These people become known as the Cajuns. So by 1756, the British are attempting to launch a full-scale invasion of French Canada. That effort fails, and we see that Native Americans become exploited and exploit both sides. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So here's just a chart that I do want you to become very familiar with. So we see here that as the war progresses, and it doesn't really progress well from 1756 all the way up into 1759, until we get William Pitt as Prime Minister, and we begin to see a shift in British strategy. But what we have here is that the English colonials and the British regular troops are involved in trying to form some kind of an alliance that would allow them to work together to defeat their common enemies, which are the Native Americans specifically, and the French. So there are a couple different important distinctions to point out. One is in the methods of fighting. The British marched in formation. They were highly strict and organized troops. The American colonists, or I should say the English colonists, they used Indian-style guerrilla tactics. They were more irregular troops, and they were used in smaller engagements. The British generals had a really tough time getting them to fall in line, both literally and figuratively. The colonial militias, they served under their own captains. They elected their own military leaders. That was a stark difference to the British officers who often had wealth and privilege and were appointed to those positions, and who wanted to take charge of the colonials themselves. So for the colonists, there was no military deference. They had a tough time following British commanders, and we're going to take a look at a primary source in a little bit that supports that. The British themselves, they drilled their soldiers. They were very tough on discipline. It was not uncommon for soldiers to be shot for disobedience, or to be whipped for insubordination. And that would become a very strong issue when they were trying to encourage the support of the colonials, both from a material position to get supplies to British troops, and also from the position of the colonials who knew the land better and would become very needed scouts and irregular militia. So the colonials themselves, they were resistant to rising taxes to support this. We'll see, especially after the war is over, this becomes a bigger issue. The British believed that the colonists should pay for their own defense, and in general, as we've stated here before, the colonials have a very casual demeanor. The British are often seen by the colonials as arrogant and often like prima donnas. So let's continue a little bit here. William Pitt becomes Prime Minister in 1757. He begins to understand that the war in North America can be won, and securely won, by encouraging the support of the English colonists. Okay, he offers them a compromise. The compromise is their loyalty and military cooperation, and the British would reimburse the colonial assemblies for their costs. This becomes an important consideration for the colonists, because later, once taxation increases, there is a lot of anger. Okay, as a result, the morale increases and more colonists are engaged. And by this point in the French and Indian War, there are about 25,000 American, I should say English, I keep falling into that trap, English colonists who are supporting the British efforts. That's pretty significant. So from 1758 to 1761, we begin to see some major military victories for the British. They move their naval troops through over in Labrador and Newfoundland. They capture Louisbourg, move down the St. Lawrence River, begin to take Quebec, and later the French fall back to Montreal. The British take that, and the French surrender Montreal. There are some very interesting stories of bravery and engagement here by military troops. The British soldiers in the middle of the night scale the cliffs of Quebec in order to set up their forces on the plains of Abraham overlooking the city and engage in a battle there. Of course, one of the paintings that I showed you concerning Captain Wolfe in the beginning is his death there, and that becomes a very famous painting by Benjamin West. So let's focus a little bit more on what happens as a result of the end of the war. So in 1763, the treaty that ends the war is called the Treaty of Paris. It is the first of 4 treaties of Paris. We'll talk about more of that later in history. France loses big time. They are kicked completely out of Canada. They lose a lot of their empire in India, and a lot of their claims to the Mississippi River and the Ohio River Valley. The Spanish kind of end up playing both sides during this war. They end up taking French lands west of the Mississippi River, New Orleans, but Florida becomes lost to England. Florida is regained by the Spanish later. So England gets all of the French territory in Canada. So let's look at the map. By 1763, there is no French presence in North America. You see the English presence here, the Spanish presence here, and of course the Russians still a non-presence over there. And of course this red line right here becomes a huge bone of contention for the English colonists. Okay, there are 3 major effects of the war on Britain. These are very important. So one, it increases the colonial empire, it puts England into debt, and the British, they begin to realize that the colonists aren't really as loyal as they may have thought that they were. So the English begin a major effort to reorganize their colonies, specifically from a financial point of view. The effect of the war on the colonists, well, one, it unites them, which actually was the goal of Benjamin Franklin at the Albany Plan of Union with his famous Join or Die cartoon. It actually creates a big socializing experience for the colonials. There are a lot of colonial troops that actually come from different colonies that for the first time begin to see themselves as a united force, not just separate representatives from different colonies. And they begin to lay the foundations for some bitter feelings towards the British. Okay, that gets worse. So, speaking of getting worse, we begin to see here that after the French lose, there is a massive attempt from the Native Americans to create an alliance of Native American forces under the leadership of this leader. His name is Pontiac, and he organizes thousands and thousands of Native Americans to attack English settlements. Now, partly you could say that they're trying to take the bitter losses of the French and turn them into their own victories. But there's a deeper issue here, and that is that the Native Americans are not idiots in this global struggle. They realize that both the British and the French represent different degrees of suffering for them. And while the English are weak, while they are financially strained, and while they are demonstrating tensions between their colonists and their British regular troops, they decide that this is a moment of weakness for the British in the 13 colonies. So they attack. They attack throughout the Great Lakes region, and they end up killing hundreds and hundreds of English settlers who are moving into this area that was recently vacated by the French. As a result, the British create something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And it basically runs through the Appalachian Mountains from north to south and creates this, imaginary line that is a boundary that the British prohibit the American settlers from crossing. Now, technically, this doesn't, prohibit anybody from crossing anything, but the British are establishing this idea that if the American colonists move beyond this line, that the British will not protect them from the Native Americans. And we'll learn in class that this becomes an issue in Western Pennsylvania because some Western Pennsylvania farmers who are collectively known as the Paxton Boys begin to demand protection from Native American attacks and begin to attack even peaceful Native American tribes. So as a result of all of this, the British decide that they need to establish firmer control over the colonies. They do so by implementing writs of assistance, which basically mean that British customs officials can check any colonial ship. They can check warehouses for any smuggled goods, and of course smuggling is prohibited by law. And James Otis is a famous Boston lawyer who challenges this. He loses his court case, and we begin to see the British establishing a firmer control specifically over Boston. We see a succession of British acts, the Sugar Act, Currency Act, Quartering Act, and Stamp Act. All of these, which we will talk about as we move towards the Revolution, establish a firmer control of the British both financially, militarily, and politically in order to try and recoup the financial losses of the French and Indian War, which they were in debt for, as well as a firmer presence in the colonies themselves. There were questions, though, over whether the British Parliament had the right to do this. And of course, we begin to see the seeds of what would later become this idea of no taxation without representation, laid out here during the mid-1760s. We also see many colonists begin to organize themselves and see themselves as patriots who are opposing British rule. They start off as a secret group called the Loyal Nine and expand into the Sons of Liberty. This, of course, would create problems for the British later on, as the colonies would move further and further away from their control. Talk to you later.